Welcome to the next episode of the Existential Files with Dr. Louie Savva.
Hello there.
There you go. You can do that. And myself, Matthew Smith. And again, we are joined by John Marmish. Is that how we say it, John?
Yes,
Marmish?
that's it. Our resident.
I think it's more Marmish, as in if you're...
Resident
I would say it's Marmish, is that right? As in you're mom-like. You're a bit like a mom. You're Marmish.
Yeah, Marmish, that's right. Like a school Marmish guy.
There you go.
Wait, we ever called? See, I keep getting the word marmoset. You weren't named after a small monkey, John.
Throughout my life, all of those jokes have been made. Marshmallow, marmoset, Amish, all of that.
How about Marmite?
Yes, that's been joked about.
When you visit Glasgow, I presume.
Well, yeah. When I was a teenager, I had a friend who was actually from London, and he would call me John Marmite, and my punk rock name John Miserable.
So we've covered them all, which is great. So thank you for that. So Louie, I know you wanted to ask John about films.
Well, we've talked about John's book, Human Nihilism. Now, before we talk about his book, he's also written a book, The Nihilist, which is a philosophical novel, which is well worth reading. I'm going to plug your book there, John, because it's well worth reading. In the vein very much of an existential novel, and I liked the autobiographical element to it. So, I always think when you read an existential novel, and this is for Matthew, who hasn't ever read an existential book in his life, but you read an existential novel, I think most of them are set in rooms. One room, something happens, but John's is very much, it's autobiographical. It's about being a philosophy professor and a punk rock, and a teenager and someone in love. And I mean, I guess one of the questions that I'm reminded of when I was reading your book is, did you lose your best friends? If I'm not spoiling anything, did your best friends die, John? Is that?
There were quite a few people from our youth and up until our 30s who, did die of various ways. None of them died by spontaneous human combustion, however.
Right.
But yeah, there were. When we were growing up, I remember one of the first people that I knew who died. He was a singer in a local band called The Pukes, Ricky Paul, that we all love very much, and he hanged himself. And that was my first experience when I was probably 16 or 17 with having someone very close to me die, and it was quite a blow. It was a real blow, and throughout life, I guess it's a common thing. For people that are part of kind of outsider subcultures, losing people through drugs and violence and such. Yeah.
And but you wouldn't say, because I can hear people saying, well, if you experience those, you have those kinds of experience, is that what made you a nihilist? And I mean, I guess that I would find that a bit offensive if somebody said that to me. But I mean, you think were you a nihilist before you had those experiences, or did they inform your nihilism?
That's a good question. Chicken or egg question.
Mm.
When I try to reflect back and reconstruct my conversion to nihilism or my awakening to nihilism, it wasn't that simple. It wasn't like I had a bunch of experiences and then thought the world was meaningless and everything sucked. It was more like I found myself attracted to certain things like music, literature, artwork that I consistently saw critics disparaging as nihilistic. And this is before I knew what the term nihilism meant. And the more and more of those types of criticisms that I read, the more and more I thought that there must be something nihilistic about me if I'm attracted to all of this stuff that has elements of nihilism in it. And that was in my teenage years. And that's sort of what led me, towards an interest in researching and trying to understand what nihilism entails.
So we've done your nihilist book, the novel, and as I say to people, it's well worth a read. I found it thoroughly entertaining. But you've also got, I believe, a new book, Cinematic Nihilism, and that's coming out very soon, I believe. So
do you want to? September from Edinburgh University Press.
Right. So I haven't had a chance to read that, but do you want to tell us about it?
It's a collection of essays, and the essays are organized into 3 sections. The first section deals with films that depict confrontations with nihilism, so initial confrontations. The second section deals with encounters. The first section deals with films that depict initial encounters with nihilism. And the second section deals with films that are focused on confrontation. So characters that are struggling with nihilism rather than just recognizing it. And then the last section deals with films that depict overcomings of nihilism, films in which characters overcome the nihilistic situation. And the thread that runs through the book is consistent with laughing at nothing and trying to claim that the overcoming of nihilism is not necessarily such a good thing. In fact, it can lead to some pretty awful consequences. So, for instance, the films that depict the overcoming of nihilism are films like Fight Club, in which a character comes to embrace his true self, but it turns out that his true self is really awful, very, very terrible. Avatar, in which the overcoming of nihilism results in a kind of fascistic society. And then the last chapter deals with Yukio Mishima, who's a Japanese nihilist. He wrote Sailor Fell from Grace with the Sea and Temple of the Golden Pavilion. And his lifelong aspiration was towards the overcoming of nihilism. And Paul Schrader made a film about him called Yukio Mishima, Life in 4 Chapters. And in his overcoming of nihilism, he committed seppuku. He cut his stomach open and killed himself. And that was his way of overcoming it. So the overcoming of nihilism can lead to things like abjection, fascism, and death. So I think the message of the book is that perhaps it's better to remain embedded within nihilism and struggling with it, to make some sort of sense out of the world, even if it's completely meaningless, than it is to come to some sort of final conclusion about the way the world is. If that the consequences of that way of thinking may be far worse than the sort of distress that's involved in the struggle with nihilism itself.
And as you've been speaking there, John, I've been just to look online to see at the outline of the book, and I see that the early chapters then you are talking about Scotland as a site of nihilistic sacrifice, another one, the myth of Scotland as nowhere in particular. Given where Louie is, because Louie finds himself ensconced in Scotland, not as a Scot, so you may say a little bit about his experience being there, but so obviously there is something about Scotland you see as important in this discussion.
Yeah, I did. Well, I did a sabbatical in Scotland, and what made me want to sort of study the culture of, in particular, Glasgow, were that there were a number of films, very nihilistic films, that were set in Scotland. So the first chapter of the book deals with Wicker Man, Breaking the Waves, and Ned's, which takes place in Glasgow, and the atmosphere of those films was very, very brooding, very, very bleak. And what I think is going on in all 3 of those films that are set in Scotland is a kind of encounter with nihilistic realities. So that deals with that particular chapter. The first chapter deals with sacrifice, nihilistic sacrifice. Nietzsche had claimed that there were 3 stages to sacrifice. That, excuse me, initially. Sacrifice occurred as a literal type of sacrifice of human beings to a god. And in The Wicker Man, you see that representation that, The Wicker Man takes place off of the coast of Scotland, and it depicts this kind of throwback society where there's a village that they yearly sacrifice someone to the nature gods. And then Nietzsche says that the second stage of sacrifice is the sacrifice of one's own instincts rather than the literal sacrifice of a human being to God. And in Breaking the Waves, you have a character who sacrifices her own instincts of fidelity in order for some strange reason, to try to appease her husband, to try to bring her husband back to health. And then the final stage of sacrifice, according to Nietzsche, is the sacrifice of God himself. And in the movie Ned's, which is set in Glasgow, you have a character who actually literally kills God, kills Jesus over the course of the film, and kind of throws himself into gang life. So yeah, in that first chapter, those types of themes are dealt with. And I thought it was interesting that the landscape of Scotland was used in order to evoke those types of nihilistic themes. And the second chapter deals with Glasgow itself, which, it's strange, it's been used in a whole bunch of different films, not as Glasgow, not as a Scottish location, but just as like this location where various dramas occur. And my thought was that what you're seeing there is a kind of clearing away of any particular meanings that are attached to the city or to, you know, Scotland itself, in order to clear the way for universal dramas. And so the nihilistic clearing of cultural markers opens the way for something new. And so that's kind of like the, you know, the positive aspect of this nihilistic clearing.
And is there any reason then why Scotland then?
Yeah, well, you know, when I went to Scotland, I went to the it's the National Film Archive, I think it's called, for the National Library of Scotland, and I was talking with the archivist there about why it is that there are so many bleak nihilistic films that use Scotland as a setting. And this is, you know, this is a phenomenon that's been commented on by a lot of film scholars. You know, there's this bleakness about a lot of films that are set in Scotland. There's more, you know, kind of positive, optimistic films recently, but the tradition seems to be to have very, very bleak films. And she was laughing about it, and she said that there's a word that they use, at least in Glasgow, called dreek, that describes the weather. And she said, yeah, when the weather's dreek, it's, you know, it's misty, it's gray, it's depressing looking outside. And she says that description also applies to a lot of Scottish literature and this genre of films that I was interested in looking at. So perhaps there is, you know, a kind of lived connection between the very landscape and the weather patterns of Scotland and the mood. I know that here in the U.S., Seattle, Washington has a similar sort of bleakness in its weather, and it also has one of the highest suicide rates in the United States. So, you know, perhaps the weather in Scotland leads many filmmakers to adopt a certain, you know, attitude towards the world.
I mean, I think if the weather led to increased suicides, there wouldn't be anyone in Scotland. I think it would be depopulated. But I mean.
Well, I don't mean to make it sound so simple, so cause and effect.
No, I mean, the weather is that shit, though. I mean, it really is terrible weather, and we don't see the sun very often in Scotland.
So, and I find it funny, Louie, that given my usual concerns of on a podcast such as this, we find ourselves talking about the weather. Given that for us Brits, we tend to find it as a national pastime. And one of my things I lament with Louie is I don't want to sit and talk about the weather. That to me suggests, what's the weather like where you are? That, you know, go to the Weather Channel. But interesting here, you're saying actually it could be a real central element of why, because in terms of your interest initially then, John, it was those particular genre films, those nihilistic type films that just happened to be set in this location, hence the sabbatical in Scotland. Is that right? Is that the kind of way it worked? And then discovering maybe why this geography and this place is a setting for such films?
Yeah, well, correct. It's like I said, you know, earlier that, you know, I realized that I'm drawn to certain artwork that has that character that's been described as nihilistic, and I saw that in these films, and yeah, that led down the route to, you know, the research for the first 2 chapters of the book. I might note that I spent a lot of time in Buffalo, New York. And there's a similar sort of phenomenon there. I mean, Buffalo is infamous for the amount of snow it gets and how cold it is and how dark it is. And it's part of the Rust Belt of the United States, where industry has declined and, you know, the economy is really bad. And it's the same maybe confluence of phenomena in terms of the economy, the weather, the particular time in history that we're living through, that you get a real sort of bleak sense in Buffalo. There's this feeling like, oh, this is not the best place in the world to live in. And so there are bands, there's films like Buffalo 66 that come out of that area that have that same character to them, that same sort of nihilistic feel. And I don't necessarily think, like I said, that it's a cause and effect. I think it's, I don't know, what would you call it? Like an upsurge of the way of life there. It's very existential. You live a certain way, you live in a certain atmosphere, and that comes out in the products that artists and writers and filmmakers create. It's it's part of their life world.
I'm intrigued, John, though. Are you investigating? Are you looking at these films artistically? Because I mean, you've got things like The Dark Knight Rises and Prometheus, and I mean, they're not the best movies. I mean, Breaking the Waves is an amazing movie, love it. But Dark Knight Rises, Prometheus, these are terrible movies, aren't they, John? I mean, are you looking at, is it the themes or is it the cultural impact? I mean, do you care? Do you think they're good movies? I mean,
I would not characterize them as aesthetically good movies. I don't think that they're artistic masterpieces, that some of the movies are pretty terrible. You mentioned a couple of them. Also, the remake of Rollerball it's an atrocity. It's just an awful movie all around. The book itself is not so much concerned with the overall aesthetics of the film so much as how they evoke the philosophical idea of nihilism. So how is it that these films represent the initial encounter that people have with nihilism? How is it that certain films represent or depict, the way that people struggle with nihilism, either actively or passively? And then finally, how is it that in these films you see the depiction of people trying to successfully overcoming nihilism? So no, it's a work of philosophy more than it is a work of of aesthetics or of criticism. So it's almost as though the films are, I guess you could say, the evidence or the raw material. And I'm looking in those films for these philosophical themes.
So
go on.
Well, I was going to say, then, do you have any nihilistic movies that you would recommend? I mean, if we say The Dark Knight is a piece of shit, have you got any?
Just say it how it is, Louie. Say it
I fucking hate that film. Sorry, I mean, I like a good movie, and The Dark Knight I think is an overrated piece of trash. But there you go.
Well, I would definitely recommend Fight Club. I think Fight Club is a masterpiece. The original Rollerball with James Caan, 1975, I think it was the date that it came out. I consider that to be an absolute masterpiece. Now, that's a film that I saw when I was a teenager, and I wasn't quite sure what it was about that movie that was resonating with me, but it stayed with me for my entire life. I've watched that movie, I don't know how many times, probably 100 times over the course of my life now, and I always get something out of it. It's very existential, and it's very, very well done. So that would definitely be a film that I would highly recommend if you haven't seen that movie.
Yeah, I've seen Fight Club, love it. I've never heard of Rollerball, so I'm definitely going to check that one out.
I've seen that one, and I've seen that probably when it came out. Yeah, so. But I think I may want to watch it again now from this idea of what maybe it's telling me more. I think I was just sort of seeing it as a movie. I remember, James Caan in that one. Yeah, and I want to say,
with Rollerball, I mean, you've got the typical existential hero. I mean, he's the quintessential existential hero who he's living in corporate culture. The world has been taken over by corporations. So, he works for the Energy Corporation, which is centered in Houston. And instead of wars, corporations have rollerball teams that battle it out. And rollerball, of course, is this ultra-violent sport that draws, millions of spectators who cheer on their teams. The whole focus of the story is how the main character, played by James Caan, Jonathan E., is now being told by the corporate powers that he's too much of an individual, and he needs to retire because he's making it look as though individual effort is worthwhile. And he doesn't understand his situation. And so the whole movie is him kind of fighting against the corporate powers, trying to assert himself. And it's, in the original movie, in any case, this is all doomed to failure, that, he's going to be crushed by the corporations at the end. And, and it ends very sort of in a tragic, it's got a very, very tragic sort of ending.
And is it that element of being, can I ask, is that element of being doomed to failure, though, is that what makes it nihilistic, as opposed to the idea of, because I think there's some elements of what you're describing there, is this idea of embracing your way of being in the universe. That was a phrase you said before, maybe in the previous podcast. It was one saying that's key in terms of no matter what you're taking, that's so important. And that I see there in that film, you've seen that theme. But is it the fact that it is fundamentally doomed to failure that makes it essentially a nihilistic film?
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the aspects that makes it nihilistic. In Laughing at Nothing, I laid out 3 characteristics of nihilism. One of them I called the descriptive element of nihilism. So the descriptive aspect of nihilism is that incongruity, or that gap between ideals and reality. There's a normative aspect to it, which is that aspect in which you think that this gap is other than it ought to be. And then the fatalistic element of nihilism is the aspect which states that there's really nothing that can be done to fix things. So in Rollerball, I think you have all 3 of those. So you've got the main character, Jonathan E., who's aspiring towards some sort of, individual authenticity. He wants to find himself. He's concerned with his individuality. So that's what he's aspiring towards. So there's a gap between what he's aspiring to be and what he actually is. And obviously he's distressed about it. So he thinks that this gap is other than it ought to be. And so the bulk of the movie is him struggling, both physically with others and, morally and spiritually with himself. And then in the end, you realize that, even though he's the winner of the final Rollerball game, that the corporate powers are still in place and they're going to crush him. And so, yeah, it's fated he's fated to failure. So yeah, I think the movie is nihilistic in all of those registers.
And I want to come back to, go on then, Louie.
I was just going to say, it's probably, I fucking hate sport, so that's probably what puts me off, is that the rollerball sounding like a bit of a sport. I'm not really that interested in sport.
But like I say, it's the best. It's the best.
I'll definitely check it. I'll definitely check it out. Yeah.
And I want to then pick up, maybe because we're going to slowly wrap things up on this one. But you were saying then to Fight Club being another one, again, which I think both Louie and I would have watched at a different time. Maybe it's time to watch it again, because I think absolutely it's a classic at any level. I'm seeing that one. I'm coming back to this idea of, because in this notion of that in Rollerball he's doomed to failure. So that one in your book, then it's in the section on confrontation. You mentioned the overcomings, and at some point I think you may have even said, oh well, to what extent they can successfully overcome. But am I right in thinking all the attempts to overcome actually weren't successful? No one was successfully overcoming this. Is that right?
Well, again, in the section on overcoming, it's the perceived overcoming that's the danger.
Okay.
I think that's what leads to totalitarianism and fascism. The thought that I know the truth and now I will impose it upon you. That's I think one of the most dangerous illusions about the overcoming of nihilism. So I have an anarchist friend who says that, in his opinion, the people who have caused the most damage to the world are those who believe that they know what the good is. And so they've come to their conclusion, and now they're going to impose it on all others. And so the point is similar to that if you've got an individual or a group who claims to have final knowledge of the truth or the meaning of the universe, then if they try to then impose it upon others, it leads to oppression, and it leads to a kind of totalitarian view of reality.
I mean, I'm going to ask the question though. One of the things that I've been writing about recently on my blog is the idea that you can impose upon yourself, and this is about identity, and that your past somehow signs you up to be that way in perpetuity, you know, for the rest of your existence. And I wonder whether you have any sympathy, John, for the idea that, you know, identity is this thing that we hang on to. You know, and it kind of, I was reading Nietzsche, you know, and as the, you know, the human is to the ape, as the overman is to the human. And I wonder if, you know, again, that identity, if we hold on to it, you know, in the dark, but ultimately it doesn't sign us up for being us into the future, you know, unless we choose to. And again, you know, I think choosing to, it may well keep us, you know, it kind of safe in some way. I think it does restrict our freedom.
I mean, I absolutely agree with you. I think that, I mean, using, you know, making reference to Nietzsche again, that continuum between the Dionysian and the Apollonian is really, really important to not deny. That, you know, part of life is recognizing that, you know, we need structure in order to make sense of the world, make our own sense of the world, and yet to deny the, you know, the chaos and the energy of reality is to kill the world. So, you know, life can be seen, I think, as, you know, a constant sort of navigation between trying too hard to impose structure and order and, you know, going too far to the other end, which is to fall into chaos. And I think identity construction, in my experience, is very much, you know, related to that. There are times where people attempt to solidify their identity. They try to say, this is what I am and nothing else, and that leads to stasis. It leads to, you know, a kind of static, dead existence. You become a mummy if you're not open to change and flux and the chaos of reality. But if, on the other hand, if you don't impose any discipline upon yourself whatsoever, if you don't try to define yourself, at least aspire towards it, then you don't go anywhere. You just flail around. And I certainly know a lot of people who tend towards that end of the continuum, and their lives are not, they're not the sorts of lives that I would choose for myself. They seem frantic. They seem, you know, out of control. And so I think, yeah, a balance between Dionysus and Apollo is finding the proper balance for oneself. That's the key to building the type of life that you can be proud of, or that you think is appropriate to yourself.
Absolutely. So maybe we can see ourselves, this podcast, as being on that fine line between order and chaos.
And it's usually more fun when things start dipping into chaos than when they're too orderly, I've found.
And I completely agree. And then maybe on another podcast, we can talk more about luck and chaos and chance, because it's one of my own interests. But I would say, Louie, is that the time we can say thank you again to John? I think that John, as our resident nihilist, you know, thank you for answering our questions. It's been brilliant talking to you. Oh, it's been terrific talking with you guys. It was a lot of fun. And thanks. I believe this is his first podcast appearance, so thank you for that. Yes, absolutely. I've never done this before. It's been a real learning experience, and yeah. I never will again. It is, yeah. It's a learning for experience every time as well. So we hope you may choose to come back to us at some point when we have more questions about nihilism and related topics. Absolutely. So thank you for that. Thank you. And thank you, Louie. Thank you very much. Yep. Thank you very much. Bye-bye for now. Bye-bye. Goodbye.